Thank you very much for those kind words of introduction, Fred, and can I say it's a real privilege to be hosted here at the Institute. I've got to say, coming indirectly from a New Zealand winter, it's really nice to be here in summer in Washington, and it's even nicer to be in an air-conditioned room here in summer in Washington. It's great that you're all able to make it today. Having had a very enjoyable dinner, it's now my role to give you indigestion as I work through a speech that looks at the broad topic, focusing predominantly on trade, but also touching on other strategic areas such as defence. Some of you may have wondered how it is not only that I'm Minister of Trade and Minister of Defence, but Minister of Defence and Minister of Disarmament. It's not because New Zealand is a pacifist country. We're actually involved in 9 different countries in security and peacekeeping roles, including in Afghanistan. But more often people say, how can you do both Minister of Defence and Minister of Trade? What do these things have in common? And the usual quip I say is, well, when the negotiations fail, as they sometimes do, we send in the gunboats. But given our size as a country, that's not always the best technique either. The topic today that you've given me is evolving Asia-Pacific regionalism, and I think that's a particularly appropriate topic for this institute. As a former member of the APEC Eminent Persons Group and author of numerous studies on Asia-Pacific trade and economic integration, Fred Bergston's work on this subject really has helped shape the policy dialogue in APEC and beyond. What I want to do to start off with is do the beyond bit, which is the multilateral trade negotiations, the WTO, because we are at a very interesting point in the negotiations, which have now gone on almost into their 7th year. I believe that we do have an historic opportunity to conclude a deal that will liberalise the terms of trade between 152 nations. As a firm believer in a rules-based multilateral trading system, New Zealand believes that the WTO has greater potential than any other form of trade agreement that we have to tackle some of the critical obstacles to international trade. And I have to say that a growth in trade, a growth in jobs and in living standards that will result if the round is concluded this year would give a critical lift to the world economy at a time when the subprime mortgage crisis and the ripples that have come from that, the inflation that we're all facing in terms of oil and food prices, and a fall in property values is threatening to cause a recession. There would be no better time for us to give a boost to the world economy through concluding the round than now. A key outcome of the round, of course, would be reduced domestic agricultural subsidies and the elimination of agricultural export subsidies, which have long biased international trade in favour of developed agricultural producers at the expense of developing countries. This Doha round is rightly called the Doha Development Round. It would benefit developing countries. Of course, it would also benefit New Zealand, because when I was first in government, in that long period ago that Fred referred to, we took the decision as a country that looked very much like an Eastern European economy based in the South Pacific to abolish agricultural subsidies, and I mean abolish them, and to remove most forms of tariff protection and almost absolutely in the agricultural area. We paid a price in doing that, but we got an enormous benefit. And New Zealand, as an efficient, market-driven agricultural economy, agricultural-based economy, benefited hugely from those changes. I think the crisis in food commodity shortages and spiralling costs provides another vital reason to complete this round. For many of our countries, and speaking as a politician, the hike in food prices causes discomfort for household budgets and therefore discomfort for incumbent governments. But if you're in a low-income household in a developing country where more than 50% of your income each week is spent on food, the result is much more critical. Estimates are at the moment that 100 million more people will be thrust into poverty, and not poverty as we define it in our developed countries, but real poverty and malnutrition as a result of that. Our achievement of the Millennium Development Goals that we so proudly pronounced in 2000 looks further away than ever before. That in turn has implications for the other side of the equation. It has implications that could result in widespread social unrest. We're seeing that in countries across the developing world now, and in political instability. The causes of the hike in agricultural commodities are complex, as are the policy options that are available to respond to that situation. In part, the crisis in food supply and prices is demand-driven. In particular, you're seeing enormous growth in big developing countries, and that has meant a demand for more and better quality food. I'm not saying that by way of blame. Of course, that's what any developing country would want to see, and why should they aspire to anything less? But that has had a huge impact in terms of the demand for those types of food, and in particular, from our point of view, dairy. We've also seen an impact of biofuels. I know that many people want to play down that aspect of it, but the truth is, as I understand it, that 25% of all American corn, for example, is now being converted into ethanol. So that trend across the developed world is also going to have an impact. But apart from demand, structural supply factors are also in play. A key factor has in fact been underinvestment in agriculture and infrastructure in developing countries. And one of the key causes of that is what I mentioned before: unfair competition from heavily subsidised agricultural products in the developed world. That's going to crush the prospects of developing that form of agriculture in the developing world. And further, the inability of those developing countries to work to their natural advantages by exporting food when they're faced with insurmountable tariff barriers to their products. I think that that situation in the world is unconscionable. How can we spend money on aid, saying that we're doing this out of humanity, and then spend 4 times as much on subsidising our own agriculture that prevents those developing countries realising a better future for their people? With tight commodity markets forecast to continue over the next decade, the need to promote efficient production of and free up the flow of agricultural goods through the reduction and the elimination of subsidies and tariffs has also been never more important than it is today. So the liberalisation of trade through the WTO is New Zealand's first trade policy priority, and we're an important partner with the United States in that process. The USTR and I work very closely together, whether it's in APEC or the WTO, and I've just recently come from meetings in Peru and in Paris of both of those organisations. In addition to that, New Zealand continues to pursue other avenues for liberalising trade with our key trade partners, both bilaterally and plurilaterally within our region. I want to now come to the Asia-Pacific region, because I think it's widely recognised that the Asia-Pacific region today is the key driver of global economic growth. The APEC economies represent 55% of global gross domestic production and roughly 50%, half of all international trade. Asia-Pacific countries are actively pursuing preferential trade agreements, both with one another and partners outside of the region. At last count, there were something like 40 such agreements either concluded or under negotiation in the region. That, of course, produces a spaghetti bowl, or as they say in Asia, a noodle bowl effect, which has its own problems, but countries are doing that. The steady movement of East Asian economies towards establishing their own region-wide preferential trade agreement also has important implications. Given the strategic and the commercial importance of the region to New Zealand, it's really vital that we're involved in the major trade initiatives in the region, which otherwise could result not only in trade discrimination, but would marginalise us within those key regional groupings. Trade discrimination across the Asia-Pacific region could also have flow-on security effects. After global free trade through the WTO, New Zealand's key interest, I think, is in Asia-Pacific free trade in line with the APEC vision. When President Clinton hosted APEC leaders for the first time on Blake Island, Seattle, in 1993, leaders produced a vision statement which declared that, and I quote, "We have the opportunity to build a new economic foundation for the Asia-Pacific that harnesses the energy of our diverse economies, strengthens cooperation and promotes prosperity," end quote. The following year, the APEC Bogor goals committed developed APEC economies to, quote, "free and open trade and investment in the Asia-Pacific by 2010. 2010 is a little bit closer now than it was when those words were written. And those words, I think, Fred, will sound familiar to you, and I acknowledge the huge role that you played in those events as chairman of the Eminent Persons Group Forum within APEC. I think that was far-sighted vision, and I acknowledge and congratulate you on what you did there. The region today is far more significant even than then in both economic and strategic terms. The case for realising the 1993 APEC vision of closer trade and economic integration has got even stronger, though it's not clear that the will of member states to achieve that vision has grown commensurately. APEC has, however, begun work on a free trade area for Asia Pacific. The FTAAP concept offers a framework for maintaining progress towards APEC's trade and investment goals. New Zealand and the United States share the goal of trade and economic integration in the region, and we work closely together on trying to develop further the early stages of the Free Trade Agreement of Asia-Pacific initiative. However, I think it's fair to say that given the challenges that many APEC economies will have to actually achieve the Bogor goals, the establishment of an FTAAP has to be seen as a longer-term goal. To, I guess, too large an extent, the pace of its implementation, just as in the WTO, is set by its most reluctant members. The alternative, and this is one that I think that we now need to look quite closely at, is to create a bottom-up process where like-minded countries agree to come together to liberalise trade between them at a much faster rate. And that's where the organisation that Fred Bergston mentioned before is important. We call it the Trans-Pacific Strategic Economic Partnership Agreement, or P4. You can see from the title why we call it the P4. It's a model free trade agreement. It's the first free trade agreement to involve several Pacific Rim countries, New Zealand, Chile, Singapore and Brunei. It has a strong strategic dimension that serves to deepen relationships between members spanning the Asia-Pacific region. The P4 achieves a benchmark matched by few preferential trade agreements and having the commitment of all four members to eliminate tariffs on all traded goods. And at the same time, the agreement adopts a high quality, what we call a negative list approach to trade and services. It also, notwithstanding the presence of both developing and developed countries, includes progressive provisions on trade and labour and trade and the environment. The shared vision of P4 members is to stimulate more open trade within the Asia-Pacific region in line with APEC goals. One of the major strategic and economic advantages of the P4 agreement is its potential as a high-quality building block towards the establishment of free trade in the Asia-Pacific region. And I have to say that I very much welcome the interest that the United States has shown in the P4 agreement. United States membership would provide the critical mass necessary to establish P4 as a cornerstone of regional integration efforts. Early membership of the agreement for the United States obviously also provides an unparalleled opportunity to influence the evolving regional trade and economic architecture. Joining the P4 is an important way for the United States to be fully engaged in the architecture of the Asia-Pacific region, the more so because other groupings within the region, such as ASEAN plus 3, China, the three being China, Korea and Japan, and the East Asia Summit, which is ASEAN plus 6, add Australia, New Zealand and India, both of those aspects of regional architecture do not include the United States as a participant. The East Asia Summit is a high-level forum for dialogue on broad, strategic, political and economic issues of common interest, which aims to promote, laudably, peace, stability and economic prosperity in East Asia. It includes the ASEAN economies and, as I said before, China, Japan, Korea, India, Australia and New Zealand. Together, these countries represent a significant proportion of regional trade and economic activity. In line with its efforts towards further integration and community building, the EAS has begun work on what's called the Closer Economic Partnership for East Asia, CEPIA. The East Asia Summit could become an important force for economic integration in the Asia-Pacific region. Again, I want to come back to the Asia-Pacific region as the driving force for world economic change. I think the 21st century is the century for Asia-Pacific. New regional powers such as China and India are industrialising, urbanising and modernising at an historically unprecedented rate. New Zealand has made a major effort to ensure its place to take advantage of the opportunities presented by these dynamic and large economies, both by seeking involvement in the regional groups and through bilateral agreements. New Zealand, on the 7th of April, became the first developed country, OECD country, to enter into a free trade agreement with China. We signed it then. It will come into effect on the 1st of October. The FTA outcome meets the shared objectives expressed by Premier Wen and Prime Minister Clark of having an agreement that was comprehensive, high quality, balanced and of mutual benefit to the two countries. The agreement opened the door for enhanced trade and investment between our two countries. China will have duty-free access to the New Zealand market for all originating goods within 9 years. For New Zealand, the opportunity China afforded us to be the first to conclude an agreement with it, notwithstanding the fact that we are its 50th largest trading partner. They are our 4th biggest export market. Getting that agreement first enabled us to avoid a scenario where we would have ended otherwise way down the list of its negotiating partners. That would have left our exporters disadvantaged in respect to those from countries who negotiated an FTA before us. For us, the FTA provides for full elimination of tariffs on 96% of New Zealand's current exports by 2019, but 2/3 of those tariffs will be gone within 5 years. It also establishes a framework for resolving trade and investment, sanitary and phytosanitary, customs, intellectual property and technical barriers to trade issues that may arise. It's a significant step in our bilateral relationship and a development that we hope will contribute to the objective of increasing integration in the Asia-Pacific region. Wider in the region, we are also looking at bilateral initiatives with Korea, Japan and India. In Korea, we've concluded a very positive study into the advantages of a free trade agreement. We're now entering into preparatory talks for negotiations, and we would look to negotiating a treaty in the course of 2009. And a free trade agreement is also under study with India, which will be interesting because India is the only country, major trading partner of New Zealand, where our food and beverage is not on the top 10 list of exports, and that's because of tariff lines that run, in the case of wine, up to 500%. It dampens trade somewhat. With Japan, perhaps surprisingly, but we have recently agreed to an authoritative joint study to continue to consider a potential for a free trade agreement, or as they call it, an economic partnership agreement. These developments are all significant in terms of the evolving regional dynamic and signify an important step in New Zealand's relationship with these countries and in regional integration. The one country I shouldn't miss out is our next door neighbour, Australia. 25 years ago, New Zealand and Australia signed one of the world's first free trade agreements. It now involves total elimination of tariffs on goods, near total elimination of any barriers to trade and services. It's a mutual recognition of standards and qualifications. It is regarded by the WTO as the world's best quality bilateral free trade agreement, and interestingly, in those 25 years, our trade has grown by 9% on average each year, which is double our trade with other countries in the world. New Zealand and Australia are now entering into negotiations, or hopefully just about concluding negotiations with ASEAN. ASEAN has a combined population of over 500 million together with Australia and New Zealand, and a GDP that is well over 700 billion US dollars. So economic integration is important for its own purpose, but it also has an obvious influence on regional stability and security. Polarisation within the region between competing trade blocs on either side of the Pacific would benefit no one. Our vision is of a dynamic and open regionalisation governed by high-quality agreements in which all players have a stake. The vision of achieving progress and stability through cooperation and integration, of course, isn't a new one. The Marshall Plan for European reconstruction following the Second World War had as its key objective peace and prosperity. The Bretton Woods system, too, had its core the goal of security and stability. One of the first political figures to recognise the security link with trade and economic integration was actually Franklin D. Roosevelt. The Roosevelt administration believed that the fundamental causes of two world wars lay in economic discrimination and trade warfare. And I think the evidence of how you can succeed in preventing that actually lies in what followed from the Marshall Plan, the economic integration of Europe to the European Union today. It began as a common market, it has moved progressively towards higher and higher levels of integration. I think one of the key achievements of that agreement is that my generation was the first in 3 generations where we did not have to go to fight a war in Europe. Trade pacts enhance the relationships between countries. They create avenues for dialogue and increasing prosperity. They reduce the opportunities for conflict. Similarly, achieving free trade in our region and the world requires a security environment conducive to the free flow of goods, services and investment. I think the Chinese leadership have appreciated that the critical factor in China's economic miracle has been that it has occurred within an environment of security and stability. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to look briefly at the question of Asia-Pacific regional security and stability from the viewpoint of my other portfolio, defence. A feature of Asia's contemporary security environment is the development of regional institutions which focus on promoting defence and security dialogue and cooperation in the region. Prominent amongst those is the ASEAN Regional Forum, established in July 1994. It brings together the ASEAN countries and members of the wider Asia-Pacific region, including major players in the region such as the United States, China, India and Russia. The ASEAN Regional Forum's objectives are to promote dialogue and consultation on political and security issues, and to promote confidence building and preventive diplomacy in the Asia-Pacific region. New Zealand welcomes the ARF's role in bringing together the major players in a security dialogue. And I sat on that as a foreign minister for 6 years, and it was a remarkable thing to see countries that had had histories of conflict between themselves around the table, talking, sharing ideas, collaborating and thinking about security issues. The inauguration of the East Asia Summit process and the evolution of APEC's role in dealing with security issues as well as economic has sharpened the focus on the ASEAN Regional Forum's capacity to contribute to regional security. New Zealand's involved in a number of other key regional fora. I won't spend much time on them, but in Shangri-La we have an annual dialogue between defence ministers which gives the opportunity for defence ministers in the region, chiefs of defence force and academics and others to come together from 27 countries, including the United States. New Zealand has a specific treaty arrangement with Malaysia, Singapore, Australia and the United Kingdom called the Five-Power Defence Arrangement that looks at a host of defence and security arrangements. Regional security architecture clearly is characterised by a set of overlapping arrangements, but New Zealand welcomes the increasing security dialogue and cooperation in the region. We recognise the important contribution that regional institutions make to confidence building and preventive diplomacy. We're pleased with the increasing focus on the development of exercises and practical cooperation between regional military forces in humanitarian and disaster relief operations. I think the tsunami in 2004 highlighted the need for that, as indeed the recent calamities in Burma and in China. And we welcome development such as the interfaith dialogue process to give us better understanding of each other and to remove misconceptions that can generate conflict. New Zealand, together with Australia, Malaysia and the Philippines, have been at the core of that, and I think that that is a confidence-building exercise and highlighting the fact that the great religions of the world actually have more in common in terms of their key values than they have as differences. Against the background of the emerging defence and security architecture in Asia, a fundamental point that will remain is the important contribution that the United States makes to security in the region. New Zealand views that role in Asia Pacific as vital to regional stability. New Zealand, for example, works very closely with the United States and others to combat the threats posed by the perils of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and of terrorism. New Zealand has been involved in that initiative for now more than 5 years, which is designed to stop weapons of mass destruction, their delivery systems and related materials ending up in the wrong hands. Over recent years, the United States and New Zealand have worked ever increasingly and more closely in areas where we share common values and objectives. That includes in Afghanistan and also in the South Pacific, where, while the picture postcard images of sunshine and swaying coconut palms, the reality has been that of failing states, instability, poor governance and inter-ethnic tension. So in conclusion, we live in a world in which both the scale and the pace of global change, economically and strategically, are of unprecedented proportions. It's also a world in which Asia has become the focus of economic and strategic change. By 2020, Asia by itself, not the wider Asia-Pacific region, will account for around 45% of global GDP, 1/3 of global trade and 1/4 of global military spending. The regional architecture in Asia therefore takes on increasing importance as a means of tackling critical challenges which arise and of maintaining regional stability and security. New Zealand and the United States are, of course, of very different sizes economically, geographically and in terms of population. but it makes sense for countries that share so much in common in terms of the systems we operate, institutions and values, also to work together as partners to ensure that the regional architecture that develops in Asia is inclusive and that we work together to pursue those objectives that we have in common. Thank you very much for your time today.
The Minister has kindly agreed to respond to questions and hear comments and alternative views from the audience. So the floor is open. I ask you to identify yourself, go to one of the standing mics, or comment into the traveling mics that will be brought around. Floor is open. Yeah, Ernie Prieg, go to the mic.
Ernie Prieg, Manufacturers Alliance. Well, a lot of things are happening in Asia toward free trade, but there's also been something more difficult time back here in Washington in recent months, particularly the loss of the President's authority, fast-track authority to negotiate agreements. And a lot of us feeling that it could be that we're sort of out of it for maybe a couple of years until this can be put back into in a negotiating mode again. But my question is, what have been the reactions in your country, elsewhere in East Asia, to what's happened here in terms of U.S. negotiating authority? Is it focusing now much more on the East Asia free trade agreement with the AP concept sort of drifting further into the future, or just how are you assessing what happened here? Because there's even a broader context, that this is in the context of a loss for the first time in 60 years of public support for a liberal trade policy, and certainly that's reflected in the Congress.
Yeah. I think the real fear that we all have, and this isn't unique to the United States, is that when conditions look towards or turn towards recession, the lesson of the Great Depression was the way you got out of that was not to increase your protectionist barriers, but to break them down and to use trade as a means to promote growth and growth that results in more jobs and better living standards. And the whole history of the post-war period is that that has in fact delivered. I think within the WTO there was a concern that the United States was not able to negotiate with the broader moral authority if there wasn't a certainty that what it negotiated would then be upheld through passage through Congress. Though Susan Swab, I think, has been quite reassuring that while she has no TPA, that does not prevent negotiation. It is important at the point that you come to ratifying that within your domestic institutions. But I think we've looked at the sort of comments that have come out of leading figures in the Democratic Congress, such as Max Baucus and Charles Rangel, that have basically indicated that provided the deal was a fair and reasonable one, that a TPA would be forthcoming. It makes it very hard for a country like New Zealand that would dearly like to have a bilateral free trade agreement with the United States. Possibly we could negotiate a free trade agreement if the administration indicated its willingness without a TPA, but that creates big risks that in the final stages of ratification of that it can be, as you say, I think, nickeled and dimed to death, and you're never quite sure what's going to come out the other end. So we hope that when after the next election, when a new administration settles into office, that there will be that renewed commitment by the United States. I see the United States as the critical driver of the world trading system. It's the world's largest economy. It has enormous influence, and utilising that influence towards greater liberalisation, I think, has been responsible probably for the best decade that we've seen from the late 1990s in terms of expanding world economies, lifting people out of poverty, creating the highest levels of full employment. So I guess my voice would be one of those in favour of the United States recommitting to that process, both for the good of people domestically here, but also for the good of world or global trade, which depends on the United States' active participation. I think, finally, the other theme of what I've been saying is that I wouldn't want to see the United States locked out of new mutual trading agreements, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, which it's in your interest strategically and economically to be part of. I think nobody wants to see an isolationist America. We all want to see the United States vitally involved in international processes, including and in particular in the trading field.
Could I perhaps personally just ask a follow-up that goes to the last remark you just made? As you mentioned in your prepared remarks, there's a lot of discussion of the architecture of the Asian region itself, the East Asian region, and also the Trans-Pacific. And you could say, and you implied that, there are competing visions. There are actually competing visions for how East Asia organizes.
Yes.
And then there are competing visions between that and a Trans-Pacific APEC-type arrangement. How do you see that evolving, thinking particularly of the views among your colleagues in Asia, Chinese views, Japanese views, ASEAN views, Korean views? Is it trending toward, I'll put it simplistically, an Asian bloc, an East Asian trade agreement that would be Asia only, as opposed to something trans-Pacific that included the United States and other countries on this side of the Pacific Ocean? How do you see that conflict, potential conflict emerging, and what would the implications of that be for the global trading system?
I think both economically and strategically, as I actually finished in saying in answer to the last question, it would be hugely negative for the United States not to be a participant in the wider Asian integration process. Some would argue that other competing countries in the region have an interest in being the biggest fish in the pond rather than having the United States there. I think that viewpoint is a mistake. I think for all of the reasons that I've mentioned in my speech in terms of stability, security and economic development, we want an architecture in East Asia that is inclusive. It's a dubious step forward to change from individual economies having tariff barriers and protectionism and blocking off trade with other countries, and then converting that into regions that have the same barriers against other regions. It sort of brings out, some Orwellian picture of what's going to happen to the world, not to have full integration in every respect. Now, how do you do that? Firstly, I mean, we are supporters of the sepia concept within the East Asia Summit, but we do not see that as in any way in conflict with also being supporters of a free trade area of Asia Pacific within APEC. I would like to see your vision achieved in the 21st century that would make the region a better place. Now, if you can't do that top down for reasons that we work by consensus in multilateral organisations, then the other way, and again I see it as complementary to do it, is to build it from the bottom up. I remember, I think it was at the end of the Uruguay round, that APEC was relatively new, and other countries that were a little recalcitrant about completing the round looked at APEC and said, my God, APEC, that could develop into something very serious economically. We're not part of that. We should conclude the round. Trying to extend that argument to APEC by the 21st century was stretching credibility a little bit. But I think an expanded P4, P5 to P10, P15, having the same high quality free trade agreement would cause a lot of countries to say, well, we've got lobby groups within the country that will prevent or will try to prevent change, but actually we can't afford not to be part of that grouping. So I think the bottom-up process, well, we're still trying to achieve the top-down process, both aim in the same direction and both would have the same positive effects. But the critical word is inclusiveness. We should not have trade groupings that are designed around or manipulated around trying to keep other countries out. We need to be part of the same international trading grouping.
Okay, floor is open. Yes, here and then Mike.
Thanks. I'm Luke Engen, a reporter from Inside U.S. Trade. You briefly mentioned dairy products, and I wanted to ask you about USTR's latest Doha round offer on sensitive products. Given the fact that it lacks the technical details needed to see just how your products would be treated under that proposal, can you negotiate with that first? Does it pose an issue? And secondly, if you're meeting with Ambassador Schwab during your visit, what might be on the agenda on that or other issues?
Yeah. Well, I'll take the second one first. Susan and I met in Bali, and then we met in Arequipa, and then we met in Paris. And we said to each other, we can't go on meeting this way. So actually, she's out of Washington today, so I won't be seeing her on this visit, but we're regularly in contact by phone and personally. We work closely together, which is not to say that either of us automatically sacrifice the interests of our own country to the other. But we see the common benefit of pushing towards a liberalised trading market. Looking specifically at sensitive products, I think we've made huge progress in negotiating sensitive products. It was one of the critical, outstanding issues in the agriculture negotiating round. I think we've got to the point now where we've resolved most of it, but not all the details that might be in the schedules. It wouldn't be a huge secret to say that New Zealand would like to be sure that the quota for cheese, for example, as it affects us, is commensurate in size with the sort of quota we will be getting out of the European Union. But I think what sensitive products showed is that when the parties at the WTO actually leave the rhetoric and the rehearsed positions behind and start to negotiate, you can make progress. And we have made progress in agriculture. We did have 175 outstanding issues. You put a square bracket around them, so that represents that it's not established. That's been reduced down to 30. By the time Crawford Faulkner, who happens to be New Zealand's ambassador but also chair of the Agriculture Negotiating Committee, finishes in a fortnight, I think we'll have agriculture at a point where a ministerial green room could resolve it. But there's a single undertaking in the WTO. Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And the United States and Europe will want to know what might be in the offing in industrials and in services, and that's a fair expectation. And it's in the industrial area where in Paris, I regret, I didn't see any movement between the parties that would lead me to believe that we were well on the path to resolving it. But officials are meeting today in Geneva. They are being asked to focus on industrials in the same way as we have focused on agriculture. And in my job, a job requirement is to be a professional optimist. So I'm optimistic in that sense that they will find a way through, because in the end, regardless of the rhetoric and the self-interest, all of us benefit from the completion of this round.
I'd like to ask a follow-up on that one too, if I may, because dairy was mentioned, and you have referenced several times in your remarks today your desire to reach a free trade agreement with the United States, either bilateral or as part of a slightly broader grouping. I mentioned we did a little report on that 6 or 7 years ago and found that the biggest problem was dairy. Mm-hmm. How do you see that situation now? Has it changed? Has the economics of the industry changed? What's now the prospect, as you would see it, in kind of objective terms for the U.S. and New Zealand to get together? And in particular, would dairy seem to still be a hurdle as it did several years ago?
I think I'll give a slightly nuanced answer to that, and to say that the reality in dairy has changed completely and the perceptions are struggling to catch up. Why do I say that? When I looked at what's happening in dairy in the United States, I found some remarkable things. Since 2003, your dairy exports have gone up 111%. Since 2004, I'm sorry I can't have the common base, but the figures didn't show it, it showed that your imports had actually dropped. I looked at whether New Zealand was competing with your dairy farmers and found that New Zealand actually, on behalf of US dairy farmers, was exporting more than half of all your skim milk powder. Fonterra uses its marketing network to market the product that is produced in the United States. And when I looked at the figures, I saw that the United States had turned around from a trading deficit, now figures are a little bit hazy in my memory, of about $500 million deficit in trading to $700 million surplus in trading in dairy products. So you've had a 1.2, 1.3 billion turnaround from deficit in dairy trade to surplus in dairy trade. Why, in those circumstances, and with record prices for dairy, would dairy farmers have anything to fear about in the United States from New Zealand? Our total dairy production is a fraction of your total production, but we are a big dairy trader. But our problem, and the challenge facing dairy farmers in the United States, is how to meet the demand for the product, not fear of being swamped by some other competitor. And I don't think that that situation will change anytime soon. When we negotiated with China, Wen Jiabao, Premier Wen Jiabao, came down to Wellington, and I remember the words he said when we were discussing dairy. He said, "Dairy is not a problem for me." It took his negotiators, David Walker, a little time to catch up with that. He said, "I want to see every Chinese child have a glass of milk a day." And that doesn't seem extraordinary from the United States' point of view or New Zealand's, but for China it was extraordinary. And it's the growth and demand for those products that will mean that there will continue to be, I think, a very healthy market for dairy products for the foreseeable future. And that's good for China, and I think that's good for our two countries. And I think it removes any real barrier to... people always said dairy was the problem between New Zealand and the United States in a free trade agreement. I don't believe that it any longer is a problem. But it might be used as a bit of a negotiating tool for a while, and as I say, perceptions might take just a little while to catch up with that reality. But that's a huge revolution in the United States dairy industry that has occurred. And I don't think you're on the back foot, I don't think you should be defensive, and I don't think you have anything to fear.
Thank you. I want to go back to one of Fred's follow-up questions. Is the mic on?
Yep.
Okay. Oh, Michael Andrews with Citi.
Yeah.
I want to go back to Fred's original follow-up question, which I thought he was going to take you into the discussion that Kevin Rudd started last week with a deepening of the APEC relationship. And he even in his speech, I think, talked a little bit about, although he thought the EU was probably too far for them to copy, but that there were some elements of that would be quite important. Do you think that's achievable in the APEC context because of the differences of the countries? And would you support that kind of effort from New Zealand's standpoint?
Yeah, I would support that effort. I do think it's achievable, but I also think it's harder, and it's harder for the obvious reasons that Asia has a greater challenge in terms of the diversity and different levels of economic development of its member countries than Europe had. But I shouldn't exaggerate that point. When you look at some of the countries that were Eastern European and where they were and where they are now, when you look at Ireland, where it was and where it is now, the great thing about economic integration is that it can bring countries very quickly up to the standards of other countries that it's part of. But the challenge is much harder in Asia for that reason. There's a greater diversity of political systems than was the case in Europe. I mean, Europe did have the advantage that one of the accession requirements for the European Union is like-mindedness in terms of political systems and values. So, yes, there's a hell of a lot more of a challenge, but because of those differences too, there's a lot more to gain. And again, I wouldn't exaggerate, when I say there's a lot of differences between the countries, like-minded systems, etc. I mean, you had France and Germany that had fought 3 wars with each other within the space of 50 years. They were scarcely friends. There was the huge bitterness and the huge destruction of the world wars, and that has been overcome. So in a way, I like to use the European Union as something of an inspiration. The Asian model might not follow that directly, but in terms of the broad principles of the benefits to people, the greatest thing that people can have is peace and prosperity. And those things are going to be enhanced by integration, and they're going to be damaged if we maintain the barriers of interchange between peoples.
Mr. Minister, Stephen Collins with the Automotive Trade Council in the United States, representing the American auto companies. I was very intrigued by your comments about the priorities of the government of WTO, number one, and APEC as an institution, number two. I think it's shared by many in the business community in the U.S. I also think it's shared a sense of frustration with what has happened in the DDA in terms of lack of ambition, and we're still not getting there after a number of years of all of us putting in, the government and industry putting in a lot of time to it. Discouragement, I think, with what APEC has been able to deliver, despite of years of all of us trying to also try to achieve some sort of binding commitments out of that, perhaps because people were waiting for the DDA. You then outlined really almost a dizzying array of other alternatives that New Zealand is pursuing and encouraging, which could be seen as an alternative to those, or as you described it, perhaps as a bottom-up approach. I guess a question and a comment. The comment was, obviously, you were picking up that there is in the United States some questioning going on about where we are in our trade policy and where we're going to go. I think partly that is a reflection in a way of questioning by a large part of the electorate about China, and you have direct experience with that. And I'd like to question what your experience in negotiating with China on an FTA was, but also to note that I think we're facing those questions too about where the global institutions, DDA and APEC, have not delivered. What is going with the other route, an undermining of those efforts, or do we pursue all avenues? And your government is, what's your government's attitude?
Right. Where do I begin on that one? First of all, my grandmother used to tell me, as your grandmother's probably told you, never put all your eggs in one basket, which is a curious saying that goes back a long time, but I think it's true. We can be enthusiastic advocates for the WTO, and we can put huge energy into trying to make it succeed, which we have done. But by ourselves, we can't be sure that we will achieve that outcome, so it would be foolish of us not to pursue other routes, but we try to, routes I should say, I've got to be careful with my language between our two countries, but we try to ensure that the other paths that we follow are consistent with the WTO. And I think the big achievement in the China Free Trade Agreement was that was WTO consistent. It was comprehensive. It was high quality. It wasn't the sort of agreement that you run off so that you can add another agreement to your list, but it doesn't really mean anything. It does mean something. I think it's a good template for other countries in their future negotiations with China, and I think that it helps the integrating process. I just want to pick up one other point that you made. Yes, I guess trade negotiations are a frustrating process, but I wouldn't belittle the achievements of either the WTO or APEC. Both organisations have moved us forward immeasurably from where we were in the 1990s in terms of breaking down barriers. It's just that you reach the point in the negotiations where in any consensus process the lowest common denominator will often prevail. And I think the other problem that we have, I quote this quite frequently, it makes me sound very culturally literate, Machiavelli in The Prince. There's a very good line there for politicians that warns politicians against change. And he says that when you try to change things, the beneficiaries of the change that you're bringing about haven't yet been created as a group. But those who will be damaged by the change are already there, and they'll be well organised and they'll fight to the bitter end to prevent that change happening. And I think that's true in trade as well as in other areas. So you have that natural political problem that, and it goes beyond that too. A particular interest group that might be small but well organised is often more powerful than the broader mass of consumers or the public that may well benefit from the change but don't exist in an organised form. So I think that you're always going to have those particular obstacles that you have to overcome in bringing that change. But I think that's where sometimes political leadership and political courage is important. It's just with political leadership you need to look over your shoulder occasionally to make sure everybody else is following. But, I think, in short, the answer to your question is no, we're choosing alternative pathways to achieve the same objective, and we try to ensure those pathways are consistent. And I think that what we've already achieved is good, but we've reached that political impasse at the moment that does make the process frustrating. And, what we always say in the WTO, when this election is over, then we can make progress. But there's somebody else's election that's just down the road.
Could I ask you one specific question about your deal with China that was mentioned? As you said in your remarks, New Zealand is a small trading partner of China's. It was clear why it was in New Zealand's interest to do the deal. Why did the Chinese do it? I handed out in today's materials an article I've gotten, new issue of Foreign Affairs just come out, in which I raised some questions about China's international economic policy, including its trade policy, and note that up till now, all of their trade agreements with ASEAN, with others, had been highly politicized, not very comprehensive, not very economically meaningful. Their agreement with you, I think, is a new dawn for China. As you went through the negotiations with them, why did they do it?
I think there's a number of answers to that question. The first is that there had been quite a significant period of confidence building. China has a delightful turn of phrase, and it talks about New Zealand in the 4 firsts. We were the first country to negotiate their WTO accession with them and complete it. We were the first country to recognise their development as a market economy. We were then the first to begin negotiations and the first to conclude it. So that in the first 2 firsts, they developed confidence in New Zealand as a negotiating partner. Not, I think, that we're a pushover, because we're actually quite well experienced in these areas, and that trade agreement demonstrates that we certainly weren't a pushover. But it was also fair to say that the areas of complementarity of our economies were greater than the areas of direct conflict. So what we produce and specialise in, and what they produce and specialise in, were complementary, and that helped along the way. I think they also wanted to demonstrate to the world that they were capable, as a country, of negotiating a quality free trade agreement. And because of the first 2 factors that I've mentioned, New Zealand was perhaps an obvious negotiating partner for them. And that didn't make it an easy negotiation. It took 3 years. It took 15 rounds. But in the end, we got there, and we got there because there was a will on both sides to do so, and a will was there because both sides saw themselves as being beneficiaries. For New Zealand, I guess there is always a fear that we're negotiating with a bigger and more powerful country and economy, which means it was a little bit strange when Bo Xilai leaned across the table one time and said to me, "China is deeply worried about your powerful dairy industry." And I laughed because Rob Portman had said the same thing about 2 weeks earlier in Washington. But in the end, there were those mutual benefits. New Zealand was worried about entering into a free trade agreement with Australia, but we proved over 25 years that despite the fact that the Australian economy is 5 times bigger than ours, that it can work to our advantage. I have no doubt that the same will be true of the China agreement, not simply to our advantage, but to both countries' advantage. And I have to add, I have no doubt that that would apply also to a free trade agreement with the United States.
Doug Palmer with Reuters. I just wanted to ask you some more questions about the Doha round. And you said that when you were in Paris last week, you didn't see much give on the industrial talks. I just wondered if you could talk about that a little bit. Is it truly? I mean, what we hear from Ambassador Schwab is that big developing countries like India, China, aren't willing to give enough in those negotiations. Is that a fair characterization of what's going on, or is it the case that the U.S. and the EU are asking too much there? And you said that in regards to the agriculture negotiations, I believe you said that you could see that those being those being ready within a fortnight, 2 weeks for a ministerial conference. Close that, but there's problems in the industrial area. I mean, this may seem to you a stupid question, but do you see there any potential of there just being an agricultural only Doha deal?
I don't think there's much potential for that because of the concept of the single undertaking, and those countries that give in agriculture will be looking to receive in other areas. I guess the broad answer to your first question is that I think there's got to be give and take on both sides. Nobody is asking for anything from the least developed or the small developing countries, and I think that's fair enough. This is a development round. But just as is the case in something like global warming, you can't have a solution that does not involve big developing countries. Brazil, India and China are all on their way to becoming super economies. This round lasts for quite some time, and we have to, I think, fairly look ahead to the point in the future where these countries also have to make a contribution. Because New Zealand is highly ambitious in terms of trade negotiations, we would say on one side to the United States and Europe, you can carve back those agricultural subsidies a lot more than you have done. The United States will say we've taken it down from 42 billion to somewhere between 13 and 16, the figure yet to be determined. Yes, that's cut a lot of water out of the system, but because you're spending only about 9 billion, we would be ambitious for you on your behalf and on the European Union's behalf, and Korea and Japan. But equally we would say to Brazil, China and India, you've got to give something, both in terms of, ideally in terms of special products, which is their equivalent of sensitive products. Yes, you've got areas where legitimately you have to protect and defend, but if a trade round doesn't result in new openings for trade access, why are we all spending so long negotiating this? So they've got to give something there, and they've got to give something on the industrial side. And curiously, although the developing countries, create an image of being at one, you'd have to say that you could suspect that a country like Brazil or a country like Argentina are partly reluctant in NAMA, the non-agriculture, the industrials, because they fear that they're not as competitive as China. But we're saying to them, you can't have, I won't get into Swiss coefficients because your eyes will glaze over, but that's sort of, say roughly, I think I could say that it's the equivalent to what the maximum tariff rate could be. The big developing countries are very ambitious for the developed countries that we should have a coefficient of something like 7 to 9. That's in Don Stephenson, the chairman's text. But they don't want to give anything better than 26. And, there's in the text it's actually between 19 and I think it does go up to 26. And the question is where the pivot, the centre point would be. Again, in the end you judge it not on the figures that you throw up, but what actual trade access would that give? And if it gives minimal trade access while demanding maximum, then that's not going to be a balanced outcome either. So I think there needs to be flexibility both ways. The Brazilians would say give more on agriculture and that's a trade-off. I don't know, that may simply be a negotiating position. But we would like to see people go into it with a will to reach an accommodation, which means that you have to give something in order to get something, and that has to apply by definition to both the big developing countries and the developed countries. So without the flexibility on either side, I don't think we'll get there. And the area that I can't talk much about yet is services, because that hasn't been the centre of the discussion. But I think certainly from New Zealand's point of view, and I know the United States' point of view, and the EU, getting something in services would be critically important as well.
We're getting close. We've got a lot of hands up, but we're very close to our witching hour. So I'm going to try to get two last questions in, Ted and Steve, and apologies to the others who wanted to get in. Ted.
Well, I should probably defer as being here, Ted Truman here at the Peterson Institute, but you in your remarks, since Fred called on me, in your remarks you talked about, you mentioned, but you didn't talk in much detail about the investment area. You said it all goes together. And I wondered if you could comment about how that actually goes together, where you now have increasing tensions about investment, in particular in the context of sovereign wealth funds, which are big in
Yes.
the Pacific region, and your own country actually has had a recently rather controversial decision in this area involving a Canadian sovereign wealth fund. So I wondered whether you could give us some of, and it's a problem everywhere. I want to, obviously, but I will your perspective on that dimension of the broader integration process.
Well, first of all, I guess you obviously with the WTO, it doesn't arise as an issue because of what happened. I think in Cancun, if I recall back that far. But in terms of bilateral and in terms of regional, we'd like to see investment as part of that. Investment was part of what we did with China. And while China hadn't done investment before, one of the things we could achieve with investment is what's called most favoured nation status, so that if a country can't move on an issue immediately, they can grant you a condition that if they reach a more favourable trade agreement in a new negotiation, a year, 2 years, or whatever time down the track, that will also be given to the original partner in the trade negotiations. So we were quite satisfied with what we got from investment there. In terms of New Zealand's investment regime, just to pick up that point, I think New Zealand that is the only investment that New Zealand has declined for as long as I can remember. We generally have a fairly free and open investment regime. It is politically sensitive, however, but we would look at gradually growing that investment arrangement in our bilateral agreements. We'd always want to have an investment chapter as part of that. And equally, that's something that might be achieved more by the P4 route. We're currently negotiating with the United States as part of the P4 grouping on financial services and investment. And I guess the United States will want things out of that we might be reluctant to give. But in turn, we will want other things. But that will be, I think, within the context of the United States commitment to wider engagement as a comprehensive member of the P4. So we might give something up in investment to get something somewhere else, which is why I think ultimately it has to be the wider arrangement under P4 rather than just where we start with financial services and investment. But I think we can find accommodation, and New Zealand will look at its position, but it will look at, if it moves from its position, what other safeguards we might get for our vital interests.
Okay, Steve, final question.
Mr. Minister, Steve Beckman, formerly of the United Auto Workers Union and a recent beneficiary of a day with Doug Johansson at Kiwi Dundee and Coromandel. You mentioned the transformation of the New Zealand economy from being relatively closed to being open. You negotiated agreements with a number of countries that have very different economic systems and political systems. One of the problems that many of the critics of U.S. trade policy have identified is the inability or the difficulty of assessing the consequences of reaching agreements with countries that have very different economic structures and how those different structures will affect the integration process as the barriers, specific barriers are eliminated. What kind of process does New Zealand go through in assessing what the consequences are likely to be of an agreement with a country like China, where whether your products are distributed, who you get to talk to, whether those companies or those entities have the political ability to accomplish what they would like to accomplish? How do you assess those results, and how do you then discuss the likely consequences with the domestic constituents that would be affected?
Yeah. To take your last point first, we have regular consultation processes with the stakeholder groups within New Zealand, which includes the trade union movement as well as the businesses. And we find that that's a pretty positive process because actually you get organised labour and business together in the one room. And because we're a little country, we like to think that we can work a little bit like New Zealand Incorporated, and that you can have everybody on the bus and included. And I think in my ministerial role, I have a ministerial advisory group that consists of people from the different sectors. So we work through those issues. I I think another point that I have to make is that back in the 80s, when we made the really radical changes, I think that the current government that I'm part of has been more moderate than radical, and radicalism, you can only have so much of it. But we were in such a bad shape because of, ironically, policies instituted by a conservative government that looked traditionally Soviet socialist, that route had been totally disproven, and the changes we made unilaterally. We didn't actually cut back our subsidies and our tariffs to help the United States or any other trading partner. We did it because we knew that if we wanted productivity and competitiveness and market orientation in our farms as well as our industrial base, those things were standing in the way of it. And it was hard, and nobody likes to give away a position of privilege. You can see that in the Farm Bill. But in the end, it was good for New Zealand, and we made the wider decision for New Zealand. And in the end, we did what was going to produce for us longer term, and it has. Today, because we don't have the same economic pressures, we understand that change and adaptation is part of progress and what we need for our living standards, but we try to do it in a more measured way and in a more consultative way. And I think by and large we have succeeded in doing that. It meant, since I've had two questions from the auto industry, that New Zealand finally decided that buying in car parts and assembling them in New Zealand at twice the cost of importing the finished product wasn't very sensible economically for New Zealand, and that industry went by the way. And that's never a pleasant experience, but if you're getting growth because your economy is delivering through a market trade position, then you very readily absorb those people that are displaced from one and you put them into another area. And the obligation of society is not to say the market works and if you fall off the end that's tough, but it's to help you make that transition from one place to the other. And that is also part of being New Zealand incorporated. So it's that social philosophy underlying a market economy. We might be a strong market economy, but we're also a strong social system. And that's delivered to us to the extent that our unemployment is still probably around 3.6%, whereas people imagined that by going the free market route, this would have a massive and negative effect on New Zealand. Actually, it had the opposite. It doesn't solve all your problems.
Mr. Minister, we are delighted that your migration across all those ministries finally led you to the pinnacle of being Trade Minister. We're delighted you bring your very rich array of experiences to us. We thank you for that. We wish you the best of luck with all these initiatives. We look forward to continue working very closely together between our two countries. Thank you for being with us. Meeting adjourned.
Thank you very much.